All right, it's so great to have Dr. Marc Brackett with us on the podcast, the director of the Yale Center for Emotional Intelligence and the author of Permission to Feel. Marc, it is so great to be chatting, and I want to start by saying that I would not be talking to you today if it wasn't for my wife, Alex, who saw you speak recently and said, Moshe, you've got to talk to this guy tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I'm glad that she introduced us because it's been fun getting to know you.
And I will say this, it's also notable because my wife, when she was my then girlfriend, very early in our relationship, is somebody who gave me permission to feel as an adult. And we'll get into, this whole concept here, but she got me to open up in my mid-30s in a way that I probably hadn't opened up my entire life.
Well, I'm eager to get into that, as you can imagine.
Well, actually, since we started there, I will say, my father was a soldier. So you can imagine, or through your experience, there's not much in the way of feeling and emotional openness there. It's you need to be a soldier. You got to carry through here. Though I will say my mother was the person who got me to express myself. But significantly later in life, my girlfriend, now wife, was like, "You're bottling everything up." And I was like, no, I can hold it all in. I don't need to discuss my feelings with you. What you do at the Yale Center, what you do in your book, Marc, is effectively that. Explain to people why emotional openness is important. And you get into this in your book, but lay it out for folks who question, like, I don't need to be soft.
Well, I see. So you're getting at a whole thing about mindset right now, which is part of the problem, Mo.
Yeah.
People think of emotions as being soft or weak. That's why they have this term soft skills versus hard skills, which I think is a terrible term. Truthfully, the math that I learned in middle school got me through life. But, the strategies that I learned to deal with my anger and anxiety in middle school, I needed to keep on working on those. As you might imagine, life doesn't get less complicated as you get older. And so the way we think about emotional intelligence is it's our ability to reason with our emotions. And that's a really important part. Reason with our emotions. It's a very cognitive thing that we're recognizing emotions in ourselves and other people. We're trying to understand where those feelings are coming from. We're trying to put words to those experiences. We're trying to figure out how to express them in ways that get our needs met, make other people feel comfortable. And then the last one is the big one, which is emotion regulation. So we call it RULER: recognize, understand, label, express, and then regulate. And
RULER is your acronym.
Yeah.
And you have 5 different categories there.
Correct. But the regulation one, I think, is where people struggle the most, right? Like, dealing with anxiety, dealing with frustration, disappointment, overwhelm. We did this study together, which I'm excited to talk about as well, about how people felt during the election, how they're dealing with their emotions, whether their candidate won, whether their candidate lost. All these things impact our daily lives, whether we're conscious of it or not. And we just want to help people be aware of those feelings, especially aware of, in relationships and in businesses, the impact of how they feel on other people, like their productivity at work, the quality of their relationships at home, and then just how to deal with those emotions in effective ways.
So you're an expert here in emotional intelligence. I remember first hearing about, as a child of the 90s, EQ versus IQ. And it seemed like a relatively new concept then, at least, I was a kid, but I remember people like, oh, well, it's not just IQ, it's EQ. Can you define for the audience, and as it relates to your book, Permission to Feel, emotional intelligence and EQ, is that something we're still looking at in people?
Yeah, actually. So it's the same skills. It's the RULER is the set of skills. And so it's a set of skills that we use to help ourselves and help other people. So, for example, right now we're doing this video and audio, and I'm listening to your I'm listening to your voice. I'm paying attention to your facial expressions, right? I'm like, is Moshe interested or is he bored? Is he curious or is he judgmental?
I am very interested in this.
Okay.
For the record, I haven't had my second cup of coffee yet today.
Okay. And then I'm trying to figure out, the understanding piece, like, why am I feeling the way I'm feeling? Why might you be feeling the way you're feeling? And then there's that articulating it. Like, is it, for example, my biggest research right now is helping people understand what we call kind of the anxiety family. As you know, from, living in New York and around the world, everybody, if I feel like stressed, I'm overwhelmed, I'm anxious. And so I ask people, what's the difference? Like, do you know the psychological difference between anxiety, stress, and overwhelmed? Do you know that in my, in millions of people that I've spoken to, no one can get it right. No one. No one can actually define these things. I'll put you to test. What do you think?
So the difference between anxiety, overwhelmed,
And stressed.
and stressed. Um, well, being stressed is related to like having a stressor, right? That there's something in your life that is creating a certain level of tension in
Mm-hmm.
you. Um, Anxiety, I feel like, again, just the way I think about it, without consulting Merriam-Webster, is sort of like a step above that. Stressor is like, oh, I'm feeling a little of stress. Anxiety, now it's like hit me to a point where it could be overwhelming certain systems and my decision making. And then overwhelmed to me would be kind of level 3, DEFCON 3 there, which is I can no longer function. Is that
Mm.
or there are limits on my functionality, and so it's all elements of that, from stress to anxiety to overwhelmed. How
Okay.
did I do, Professor?
Um, I'm going to give you a B minus.
F.
I'm going to give you
B
a B.
minus. Okay.
minus.
All right. So for the record here,
Your effort.
overwhelm, stress, and anxiety. How should we think about it?
When we're anxious, we can't predict the future, right? We get anxiety when we see a lot of uncertainty in the world around us. That's anxiety. Stress is when we have too many demands and not enough resources. Overwhelmed is when we're overcome by emotions and we're just saturated. And the reason why that's important is that, if you're a parent or if you're a partner or anyone, people use these words interchangeably, but the solutions are very different. Think about it. When you are, anxious about the future, just doing breathing exercises is not going to help you change the way you're thinking about all the uncertainty around the future. You're going to need to really shift your thinking. Like, Mark, you got no control over that. I remember when the pandemic hit and it was like, what's going to happen to Yale? What's going to happen to my leadership meetings? What's going to happen to our program in schools? And I just had to work on my brain and say, Mark, you're not the seat, you're not in charge of the university. You're not going to make choices about when it opens or not. You got to just be still and let it go. And and that really was helpful. When I was stressed, when I got 5,000 emails from people around the world in a matter of 2 weeks saying we're freaking out, what are we going to do about our feelings? I was stressed because I had way too much on my plate and I didn't have the resource. I couldn't figure it out. What am I going to do? Am I going to answer these people? Am I not going to answer them? And so that's stress. And so what I did for that is really different. And when I'm overwhelmed, oftentimes, I just shut the computer and I go take a walk and just be give myself a break. It's give it some space. And I think that's important for people to be able to differentiate, what their experience is and what strategy will work best for that experience.
You are very precise with your descriptors for various emotions here. When, for most of us, we tend to just treat them like they're all synonymous.
Exactly. We call those the clumpers. There's everything's good or bad. I feel like shit. I feel great. And, it's not really great for communication or, getting your needs met as a kid, especially. Even at my university, I did a study with students who, very high academically, in terms of scores. They were stressed. And when I got deep into their stressors, it was nothing to do with stress. It was all about envy. And so really what they needed to do is stop thinking about how everyone else is richer than they are and more successful than they are and can study for less hours and get better grades than they have. That's their brains were just preoccupied with everyone else being better off than they were. And so, yoga is not going to solve that problem. Yoga will solve the overwhelm. It'll solve other things. And it's a great thing to just do in your life. But you really need to restructure your thinking if you're just sitting around thinking that everybody else is better than you. You got to start having some gratitude. Think about it. You're in a pretty good place, and other ways of kind of reframing, I'll call it.
So when we were talking just before hitting record here, I asked you to estimate how many people you think you've spoken to. And you said about 100 million, Moshe. With that in mind, having spoken to that many people, over the course of a number of years here. Where are we going directionally? Especially here in America, I know that you talk to folks abroad as well, because there's been a lot of talk in recent years about the impact of smartphones and the impact of social media.
Yeah.
What have all those things? I mean, I know it's a lot, and you're a scientist, so you try to be
Yes.
precise as opposed to causation, not correlation.
Right.
But ultimately, what is your sense of technology, social media, and what it's done to our emotional well-being here in this country?
Yeah, I would say the research is pretty clear. Now, not a lot of causal research, but a lot of correlational research and a lot of just anecdotal evidence, that, we know that, even a smartphone on the table when you're having a meal with someone makes someone feel less important. Like literally just not even picking up the phone, just them seeing your phone next to you while they're having a conversation makes them feel less than. And like something's going to come up where that little phone is going to be more important than me. And that's important to know. And that's easily changeable. Like we try in our family, like can we just have a meal without a freaking phone? And it does make a difference because it's so tempting even to look something up. Like, oh, what do you think about that place? And then all of a sudden you're like lost in that phone. We do know that the amount of time that children, adolescents in particular, spend on their phone, which right now is about 6 hours a day.
It's half of waking hours.
Yeah. I mean, I'm 55. And so like, I didn't have a phone when I was a kid. And, I was forced to go outside and play. I was forced to read books, spend time with my family. Maybe I watched some television. But I didn't have an object that was like consuming my, every thought, feeling, for 6 hours a day. And we do know that not for everybody, but for a large portion of adolescents, it does correlate with anxiety. And so we just need to be aware of it.
Has it limited our ability to express our emotions?
Definitely. And I say that with an emphasis because there is some research on that as well, that even adolescents today prefer to communicate via text than in person. And so my thinking about this, I come at this, I'm a life span researcher. And I just think about like how are people going to have like intimacy when they're in their 20s and 30s? I really worry about that in terms of people's ability to really be with and look someone in the eye and tell them that they love them and hug them and just be in relationship. And not just be like, wait a minute, I got to check my phone, or just have lost the skill of connecting because they haven't practiced it very much at all because they're constantly on their telephones.
Because when they prefer to have their most significant conversations, they're having it via text message, and not in person. And that interpersonal skill is well, it's not just personally, right, but also professionally as well.
Yeah, I mean, people are connected to devices like we are right now, all the time, and at least we're looking at each other. But, for the most part, and then obviously the other challenge with technology, especially social media, which is, I think, the real culprit, are the algorithms that get formed for children, especially when they start looking at certain images. And so then you're just bombarded with, let's say you're obsessed with muscular bodies if you're a man, or another kind of body, if you're a woman, and then you're just endlessly being, you're endlessly being pushed images that look like that, and that affects your self-esteem. It affects these are like the 500 people in the world who have these amazing bodies. They don't represent the other 5 billion people around the world, and you start having self-esteem challenges, and we know that from the research. And so I'm not a person who says I like social media. It actually helps me fall asleep at night, because I look at stupid videos. I just like the stupid stuff. And like, I'm a thinker, it's my job to think. And so I need to like sometimes just get out of my head, and like watching stupid videos or like looking at something, it helps me just kind of like chill out and I go to bed. But for other people who are using it in a different way, I think it can be quite dangerous.
So we have a lot of parents who listen to this podcast, and the question they're all going to have is, how do I ensure that I raise my child to be emotionally intelligent?
Good question.
What should I be? What should I be doing? There's all these various versions of parenting, gentle parenting. There's the Instagram algorithm already knows me very well, and that I have a child, and so it feeds me a lot of this stuff as well. What are the sort of the rules of the road here? Also, as a college professor that sees these kids when they come out of high school, to raise your kids accordingly.
Well, it's interesting because we started off having this conversation around, permission to feel, and that, you had a father that was like this and a mother that was like this, and you had a girlfriend that was like this, and your girlfriend gave you permission to feel. And so, that concept that I coined, I guess, permission to feel, is a big one for me, because in my research with children and even adults, only about a third of people around the world that I've studied believe they had permission to feel. So
define permission to feel, by the way.
Yeah. So from the perspective of permission to feel, it's this idea that as a child, as a partner, that you feel emotionally supported. You feel as if you can be your true self with a person. So the question in my research is, do you feel when you were growing up that there was someone with whom you could talk to about your feelings, someone who was emotionally supportive? And only a third of people say yes. And the characteristics of these people in my research are there's three core characteristics. Do you want to guess what they are?
Of the person who allowed you to feel?
Yes.
They are a great listener.
Okay.
They withhold judgment. They were given permission to feel themselves at one point in their life. So they're able to mirror that.
Not necessarily the last one. The first two you got down perfectly. It is good listener. It is no judgment, like non-judgmental. And the last one is empathy/compassion. And so when you think about that, when I ask kids, how non-judged do you feel? How judgmental do you think your parents are and the other people who take care of you? It's like skyrockets. From the moment I was born, I was being judged, like, you're not smart enough, you're not this enough, you're not this. Everything is, you're not enough, you're not enough, you're not enough, work harder,
I feel like that's got to be a trait among a lot of my fellow first generation types too, where you have immigrant parents who are like, I made it, like, do you know what I went through as a child? Like, no complaining about what you have here.
But there's a way to push our kids to be healthy and successful without making them feel like they're not enough. I think that's an important piece here. And what's interesting to me is that a lot of parents that I speak with say things like, well, Mark, it's my job to be judgmental. I got to make sure my kid is successful. And I always say to them, like, who told you that was your job? Nobody asked for that. So in the literally tens of thousands of people that have participated in my research, including people like of your age and my age, no one ever says that the person who gave them permission to feel was smart, which is interesting. They never say they were a problem solver or a fixer. They always say non-judgmental, good listener, and empathic and compassionate, and some other things like caring or loving. But I think that it's actually good news for parents, because your kids don't want you to fix them. Your kids aren't looking for you to tell them what to do. They just want you to be there with them and help them think through things and kind of collaborate in many ways. And I find that very relieving as a message, that we think that we should be the fixers, but that when we ask ourselves or others to reflect on those relationships that were the most powerful and meaningful, it's always the non-judgment, empathy, and listening.
But there's got to be a balance there, right? Because, ultimately, your kid made a bad decision or a bad move, or it at times does need parental guidance. I guess you got to draw the line there in terms of when you're what is hand-holding and what is basically carrying them across the finish line.
Yeah, it's sort of like, I grew up in a family. So my parents were second generation. Good people. But, my father grew up very poor in New York City, and my mother grew up kind of middle class in the Bronx. And they escaped to New Jersey because that was what you did back in the 70s, and to get out of New Jersey or get out of New York, the rat hole, and then to of course, now when I look at the apartment building that my father lived in when he was a kid, and he told me it was for sale for $17,000. It was like it was a building with 8 2-bedroom apartments. Anyhow, that's an opportunity lost. Anyhow, he left New York, went to New Jersey, and they wanted a better life. But the real point here is that they were raised by people who knew nothing about emotions. My mother had terrible anxiety, never ever learned how to deal with it. She'd always say things like, "I'm having a breakdown," and then go to her room and disappear for
Is it
hours.
because they grew up in an era, and then our grandparents grew up in an era where like there were much more significant things happening in the world? Like they just didn't have time to consider their emotions, and so there was never really that discussion. They didn't have the privilege of being able to really be
I don't think so.
introspective. And no.
No, I don't. I mean, yes, I hear you on that, but I just think that it's larger than that. It's more of how emotions have been seen in the world, up until the last, say, 50 years. They were, emotions were viewed by psychologists as disruptive. Rule your feelings or your feelings will rule you. Those are old sayings. And nobody wants, nobody feels good, when they are just told to, suck it up.
Suppress.
Right. And
right. You write in the book, if we suppress our feelings, they only become stronger.
They come out somewhere.
Yeah.
Right? They come out in our eating behavior, our sleeping behavior, the way we treat people. Feelings have to go somewhere. And we saw that, we're not gladiators anymore, thank goodness. But feelings did go in interesting places. And just lastly, my father grew up in a family that was a lot of anger, really, really dysregulated. And so what did they know about raising an emotionally intelligent kid? They knew what love was, but they didn't know, they didn't have skills. Like when I was, being terribly bullied in middle school, which I had really bad bullying as a kid. My father's mindset was, son, you got to toughen up. My mother was like, tell the bullies that your mother loves you. It's like, okay.
You're like, mom and dad, this is the worst advice ever.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I'm like, not a good idea. Like, I'm going to be like, someone's going to be like punching me in the bathroom. Wait a minute. My mother loves me. And that was all good intention, but, not skillful. So anyhow.
Well, that's an important, you tell your origin story in the book.
Yeah.
And it was your uncle, right, who gave you that permission to feel, who opened up that conversation. So as we think about this, oftentimes we look to the parents that are raising you, but ultimately if the doors are closed, so to speak, with your parents, there are other adults in your life.
Totally. I mean, I got involved in the martial arts. I had a really great relation with that teacher when I was older. I had a great mentor in my 30s when I was building the center. And so, I think that I think part of it is helping people to understand from the psychology research, like look for people, whether it's your significant other or your colleague or your boss, who kind of has these characteristics. These are the characteristics of the people that we want to be around. And, it's interesting how, like listening. I mean, we've been talking about active listening for decades now. And I don't know about you, but like, I just noticed that people just are terrible listeners.
Oh, listen, having worked in journalism and worked as a producer with a lot of reporters, I can count on just a couple of hands the reporters who actually listen. I mean, people are doing live interviews on cable news and network newscasts, and I'm like, did you just listen to what the person just told you? And certain times, like you'll notice reporters like, wait, did you just say that? Like, can we talk about that? Whereas some reporters might just have their questions in advance, and they're just like, all right, question 3, like without having just listened. Like, this person just said something crazy. Like, ask them about it.
Exactly.
And these are people who are paid good money to listen.
I know, it's so weird to me. And that quality of feeling listened to, there's nothing better than it.
That's something I want to get at, because you mention the health connection to emotions.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a lot of research here. Anger leading to heart attacks, stress more likely to get sick, crying on the positive side, crying getting the stress hormones out, laughter repairing cells, gratitude, boosting your immune system. I think for a lot of us, we discount this or are completely unaware of just the physical toll or benefits to all these various emotions.
Yeah, I mean, think about it. When you feel listened to, when you feel safe and like the person. By the way, I think what happens with those three things of non-judgment, good listening, and empathy is that it opens your soul. Like you just feel like, I can breathe. I can trust this person. They're not going to gossip about me. They're going to be with me. They're not going to necessarily tell me what to do, but they're just going to be there and show that they care.
And again, that's an important distinction: is listening to someone without immediately giving them advice on what to do.
Oh yeah, I have some family members that they're very good listeners, but they use it they go right for the jugular after. It's like,
what were you thinking? What you should have told them was
totally. Yeah, it's like listening to like probe and like negate. Ugh, drives me crazy. Anyhow, the real listening piece and the non-judgment empathy piece goes back to trust and safety. That it's like that feeling of being psychologically safe in a relationship. There's probably nothing more important than that, especially for young people. And what I just want to say also about this, that's I think important for your listeners, is that when I ask adults and parents in particular about the barriers, like what's getting in the way, like why can't you just be good at these three things? They say things like time. I don't have the time. I'm like, you don't have the time to be non-judgmental? Like, really? Let's talk about that a little bit. The second one goes back to the whole reason why I wrote my book, which is I don't know what to do. I'm scared. I don't know how to handle, like if my kid tells me they're depressed, I'm going to freak out. Like I'm still dealing with my depression from my childhood or my anxiety from my childhood. And now you want me to know that my child is actually anxious and do something about it? And the answer is yes, because there's nothing better for your child's mental and physical health than you supporting them, through any difficult emotion. And the last thing you want your kid to believe is that you can't help them or that they have to hide their feelings from you.
So but kids are coming back now, and we talk about the mental health crisis in this country, especially among young people, and it is, overwhelming and concerning to parents. Maybe the parent had experience with it, maybe the parent doesn't have experience with it, and that's what makes it even more scary to address with their child.
Yeah, so I think step one is for parents to just have a mindset. They got to shift your mindsets. Not just parents, by the way, everybody. That emotions are information. Wow, that's interesting. Emotions are data. It's a scientific thing that how I feel and how other people feel influences my attention. It influences my decisions. It influences my relationships. It influences my health and my performance. It's interesting, going back to my work as a professor at Yale, I came in with a lot of imposter syndrome because I didn't have an Ivy League education. And I thought all my students, they're just going to be their superstars. They have the perfect scores. And now, 23 years later, not everyone is so successful. And the question is, well, I always say to my students, like, your IQ got you in, but your EQ gets you out. And because no one really is looking for someone who's that smart. When you really think about it, most people who apply for a job are usually smart enough to do the work. But it's like that feeling you get when you interview them. It's that feeling of like, are they a team player? Do I want to sit down and have a cup of coffee with this person? Can I tell them stuff without knowing that it's going to get leaked and, whatever else? And it goes back to those characteristics. But yet our education system has decided that, we're going to do this as like an add-on. Like, some schools, if they can afford it, they'll bring in some training in this, but it's going to be still like a workshop-y thing. It's not going to be like a permanent part of our education system, which is what I'm fighting for. Because when you look at adults who really are successful in a fuller way, other than like making a lot of money and having a lot of power, because that's not my definition of success. My definition of success, right, is having really good relationships, making great decisions, having, well-being, not, dying alone, when nobody wants to talk to me. I always say, like, the bullies can be successful. They're really, really lonely when they get old, because no one wants to support them unless they're going to inherit some of their money, maybe. But anyhow,
They create another generation of bullies.
well, they do.
Like kids, like parents.
Yeah. And so, this is a set of skills that never get solidified. And my hope is that preschoolers, elementary kids, middle schoolers, high schoolers, and even me, I'm 55, as I shared, like, life changes. All of a sudden a pandemic comes, and, I make a joke in this new book I'm working on, where my mother-in-law moved in with us during the pandemic. And I wasn't anticipating my mother-in-law, who was 80 years old, to live with us. She's from Panama, because we couldn't get flights back to Panama during the pandemic for 7 months. No way to get her out of our house. And and I love the woman, but like 7 months, it's like, I'm not anticipating like this new life space change. And it was tough. And I'm like, I learned every single park in Connecticut. I just every day I went out for a 2-hour walk, whether it was like freezing or not, just to give myself some space. I had never walked in parks before as a regulation strategy. So my point is that, like, that's now, and walking now has become a big part of my like regulation work. I just love taking walks now. So, 55, learn new strategies. That's what this work is about.
You mentioned, from preschool on up, you've talked about, the need to reform the education system.
Yeah.
To include prioritizing emotions. What are there examples out there of schools that you think are doing a good job of this, and what ways are you proposing ensuring emotional education, so to speak, within a curriculum starting in elementary school? Like what are things, for the teachers who are listening, or examples out there of effective strategies?
Well, that's my work. And so Ruler, by the way, is the name of the set of skills of emotional intelligence, but it's also the name of this program or curriculum that I have been working on with many colleagues for, starting with my uncle. My uncle did this work in the Catskill Mountains of New York State in the 1970s. He wrote a curriculum to teach kids about feelings through history. And so he would have the students identify with the characters' emotions and make learning history relevant for them. He said, my kids are milking cows in the morning. Why are they going to want to learn about the Roman oligarchy? Like, where is there any relevance to their lives? And so he started to make these connections between, for example, in the oligarchy, like, what would it feel like to have all these leaders? How would we function if you had multiple captains on teams? Like, how would that feel if it was a sports team? And the kids would have lots of opinions about that. It gets them excited about the connections, and then teach the history through that lens. And so he and I, and now a bunch of other people, my colleagues at Yale, have spent many, many years writing a curriculum to teach kids this from preschool all the way to high school. And essentially, it's taking feeling words like the word sad or frustrated or elated or ecstatic, and helping teachers integrate that into the curriculum, creatively. It helps them to share their stories around when they felt that way. And importantly, they get into really rich discussions about, like, what do you do? I'm going to share something that was one of my favorite moments in my career in the last 5 years. So I'm visiting a school in New York just last week, and 4th grade. And I am talking to them about the feelings of excitement versus elation. That's pretty sophisticated for 4th grade. What do you think?
Yeah, I would say that I was just trying to think, like, how do I define elation versus excitement slightly different? Like, how actually, as we talk about it, how do you define those differently?
One is more anticipatory, right? Like, I'm excited to get on the podcast.
Yes.
Mosh, right? I'm excited. I'm feeling like it's a positive anticipation. But, if it turns out well, right, if it's good, I'm going to feel elated. Like, we did a great job. I'm not going to be excited. I'm elated, right? It's a feeling of like accomplishment and happiness. So I have these kids like really think about this stuff. They're doing a great job. And then the technique, the next phase was savoring elation. And so how do you savor it when you're feeling that? Oftentimes we kind of dismiss our positive feelings. We kind of like move on. We don't really think about regulating them. We regulate anxiety. What am I going to do? I'm anxious. And everybody says, oh, you can try this and you can try this and you can try this. But rarely do we ever talk about, like, how do you preserve your feelings of elation?
Celebrate the win.
There you go.
Yeah.
Like, talk about it. Like,
it's a discussion we have in our household. I'm bad at it. Yes.
I am too, because it's sort of like next.
Exactly. Yeah.
But like, it feels good. When I give a good talk and someone comes up to me at the end and says, like, you really moved me and I feel like empowered to take this work and bring it into my family's life. I like hearing that, actually. And and I walk away and I think about that and I'm like, gosh, like, I didn't think it was that great of a talk, but like, someone left, feeling inspired, and, let me remember that, Mark. That's a good thing to remember. Not the one thing that you said that you thought was stupid, which, and so anyway, these kids had this great card. They came up with all these amazing strategies for preserving and savoring elation. And so at the end of the conversation, I asked these kids, I said, your parents are going to know that I was in your classroom today because your school always sends home a note when I come visit. What are you going to tell them that you learned today? And they had two assignments. One was they had to teach their parents the feelings. They had to go home and teach their parents the difference between excitement and elation. But then what was like the take-home message? And this one young girl, she looks at me, she's like, I feel like I've learned a new form of empathy. I was like,
Fourth grader.
I was just like blown away by that, and there is actually a term called positive empathy, which is like, just adding that little extra compliment, helping someone to, not just, when there's a misfortune, to say, my goodness, I'm so sorry for your loss, but, embellish the pleasant experience. So that's the kind of work we do in schools. And, I think it's really important because, life is tough. And no matter how smart you are, no matter how creative you are, life is filled with frustration and disappointment and anxiety and despair and harsh feedback. And what my research shows is if you don't have the strategies to deal with the emotional side, of your goals, you tend not to achieve as much.
And I'll add to that, as somebody in the news business, like even a few years ago, if you're like, Mo, if you're going to do news on Instagram, I'll be like, what are you talking about? And somehow fell into that during COVID, and now, doing it and growing it. And we'll get to the study that we just worked on together because of it in a second. But, some people, I'll get the question often, almost daily, has it always been this way? Like, are things worse today than they were before? I'm like, no. Like, if you go through human history, we've always had wars and tragedy and all of that. We just didn't always have it 24/7 live into our pockets. That's a new phenomenon. And that requires a different level of managing your emotions and your stress and all these inputs.
Yeah, it's, as when I get pushback, which I do get a lot of pushback, by the way, on this work from parents, from politicians, from a lot of people. One parent said to me, I share with them how my research with high schoolers, which was a big study of 45,000 high school kids across the United States, show that they're tired, bored, and stressed 77% of the time they're in school. And so the parent said to me, well, hasn't it always been that way? And I said, well, maybe, but do we want it to be that way?
Just because you had to walk to school uphill both ways, right? Does that mean that it has to be that way for every generation?
Exactly. Like, that means that maybe a third of the kids, find their way of having joy and inspiration or something. But like, really, can we, like, how about we just change the way we educate to create more inspiration and, more optimism and hope as opposed to dread? I was actually I'm in Los Angeles this week, and I was visiting a friend of mine who's a producer, filmmaker, and his kids were there, and they're in, very good schools, private schools here. And they were showing me their homework. And I have to tell you, I was blown away on how boring their homework was. It was like a worksheet. Like, I was like, it's 2024, and you're getting a worksheet that says, to, when you're reading your book, to, look for the evidence, and I was just sort of like, oh, talk about wanting to pull the joy out of reading out of a kid, where the only thing they're asked to do is look for the, the evidence that the character, did X, Y, or Z. Just really was, I couldn't believe it, actually, because I was hoping that we were moving away from that kind of rote kind of way of teaching things.
Well, hopefully, with some of the work that you're doing, we're going in the right
Yeah.
direction here. Speaking of work that you guys are doing, we were able to collaborate on a study of the Mo News community's emotions going into the election and coming out
Yeah,
of the election.
that's right.
Thousands of people participated. Big picture here, Mark. As we talk, as we speak here, we're just after a month out from the election. What was the biggest takeaway, the most surprising takeaway that you had from the research around the before and the after when it came to this year's election?
Yeah, so a lot. I mean, there's a lot of key things that came up in the study. I think, going into the election, I would say that our nation was just feeling a ball of anxiety. There was a
Well,
lot.
you had both sides saying that the world was ending if the other side won.
Exactly.
That probably didn't help.
Yeah. So that uncertainty, remember,
Yeah.
and a lot of anger and a lot of fear, and then there was also some hope. So both sides, were hoping.
We looked at the numbers here, and we asked people for their like, how are you feeling, right?
Yeah.
2/3 basically felt anxiety or fear. Another 25% felt frustration or anger, and then there were the 15% hopers. So
Yes.
1 out of 6 people who took the survey said, "No, my biggest emotion here is hope when it comes to this election."
Yeah. And interestingly enough, I was able to look at the data more kind of in a granular way. And what we did find was that the hope was a much greater emotion for people who were voting for Trump than for Kamala Harris, which is interesting. And actually, that relates to the other big finding, of the study, which was that, we asked people about how they felt. Like, do you feel hope around Trump? Do you feel anger around Trump? Do you feel hope around Kamala Harris? Do you feel anger around Harris? And what we found, which I think is something just that I need to think more about it in terms of like the implications for like just the world, was that people's feelings about Trump, whether you were a Trump supporter or a Harris supporter, were what drove people to vote for, their person. And so I think that's just really interesting that a lot of the hope that people had for Donald Trump was really the guide or the push for them to vote for Trump.
And even if you had hope around Kamala Harris, ultimately you found there was the greater predictor were negative emotions around Trump. Basically, it was the Trump election and how you felt about him dictated your vote. And while she was the other candidate, ultimately it was your feelings about him, your emotions, hope, joy, anger, whatever, that led you to vote the way that you did.
Exactly. Another, I think, interesting finding, which is something that I was personally interested in the research, there's this whole line of research about how we're terrible about predicting, how we're going to feel. Like I did a very similar study back in 2004 with the Bush-Kerry election. And I asked this was just not with people like in the real world like we did with you, but this was just with college students. And, so my undergraduates, if Bush won, if Kerry won, and back Yale, has a lot of Democrat students, and so all the Democrat students said, I'm dropping out of Yale and I'm moving to Canada.
That was people forget. Yeah, that was a big thing in 2004. If Bush wins again, I'm moving to Canada.
Well, the day of the election, I asked my students, "How you doing?" And they were doing just fine. Nobody moved to Canada, and and so the point is that we, in the moment, when our emotions are running high about, the things that we want out of life, whether it's Harris to win or Trump to win, where we just think, oh my gosh, if this doesn't happen, my life is going to be over. But the truth is, and not for everybody, because for certain people, I think the results of this election will impact their lives in greater ways. But for the most part, life continues. And it's not the impact of even the president is not as great. And this is not my opinion, by the way, because I don't want people to say like Mark doesn't care about people's opinion, people's emotions. This is not about my feelings or anything. It's just from the research, which shows that we tend to over predict the negativity of things, and we found that in the study. And so what we found was that actually what we found was very interesting was that for the people who voted for Trump, they their predicted positivity or happiness was they were not as happy. I mean, so like it's weird, right? They
They underpredicted their happiness.
exactly.
So the Trump voters told us in the survey, I'm going to be this happy if he wins. And then we did the post survey with them, and they were even happier than they predicted.
Correct.
And then the Harris voters over predicted how upset they would be.
Exactly.
Going into it, you're like, if a Harris voter, if Trump wins, how are you going to feel? Oh my God. And then we did it afterwards. You're like, I feel bad, but I don't feel as bad as I thought I was going to.
Exactly. And I think that's just so important for people to understand. Now, going back to like, why is emotional intelligence important? Well, from a theoretical standpoint, if you're aware of these forecasting errors, I'll call it, you might just not be so crazy, in the pre-election time. Or forget about pre-election. By the way, this applies to going to the gym. Like if, let's say you've gained some weight and you want to lose some weight, and you think, oh my God, I'm going to be so embarrassed if I go to that aerobics class at the gym. The truth is, you're going to be a lot less embarrassed than you think you're going to be because no one's looking at you, right? Everyone's looking at themselves in the mirror.
Everyone's looking at themselves in the mirror, yes.
And you're going to feel great afterwards because you've actually accomplished something, which is exercise, which we know from research actually, increases positive emotions.
So that's the Harris voter scenario. That like if I go in, like going into it, Trump wins, oh my God, it's the end of the world, and I came out, it's like, oh, it's bad, but it's not as I don't feel as bad as I thought. So right, that's the going to the gym.
I still got my, my friends. I still got my job. I still, my family is, we're still going out to dinner. I mean, I went out to dinner the day after the election. I was like, wow, it's really busy, these restaurants. So like people continue, and that's good. We want people to be resilient and continue, and this is the part of being emotionally intelligent, which is that your emotions don't have to drive you to be debilitated. It's the opposite. You should use your emotions wisely, and if you're, feeling good about what happened because of your values and other things, then you keep pushing that. If you're not feeling good about it, then you transform that emotion into action to make change for the future.
But I'm curious about the other side, the Trump folks under-predicting how happy they would be. Because yes. I think when we were talking about this initially, I was like, well, it's to me, you always expect that New Year's Eve is going to be amazing or Halloween is going to be amazing. Like something's going to be amazing. And then you come away from it, you're like, it wasn't as great. This was a rare flip of that where like, I think I would be happy, but like I'm actually that much happier than I even thought I was going to be.
Yeah, it just is what it is. So it's just an interesting phenomenon that that people who were on that side of the election just, it really brought them more pleasant emotions than they even anticipated. I don't even know what to say about it. It's just.
Do you? I mean, and I think it might speak to the fact that there was also very decisive. Like, we were also anticipating going into the election that this thing might last days or weeks. Yeah. And be super close, and the fact that we effectively knew the result within a few hours on election night may have
supported it. Although I think we did the follow-up study. The follow-up was the week after. That week, a couple of days after the election. But again, I need to spend more time with these data to really unpack them. But for me, it's I guess with the Trump voters. They that victory was more powerful than they anticipated it would be. But I think importantly for the Harris voters, they're not like locking themselves in their rooms and clinically depressed, which is also important. They are. It does. By the way, I shouldn't say that so matter of factly, because we did some other analyses, and we did find. That people who felt like morally injured, by this election are higher in anxiety and depression right now.
And I've gotten them anecdotally, Mark, people who have followed me for several years. Some of them sent me notes being like, hey, I need to unplug from you for a while. No personal offense, but like I am, and again, these are Harris voters, like so bummed about the result. Like I need to disengage from news and information for a while.
Yeah. And, if that's what they need and they're clear about it, then that's fine. They'll come back when they're ready. I think that's a big part of being emotionally intelligent too, which is, I remember going back to another phenomenon with the pandemic. How many of us were glued to our news channels? 1,000 died, 10,000 died, 50. After a point, I was sort of like,
Oh,
Mark.
the worst thing that my former colleagues in news did, they were running those tickers on the bottom of the screen with the
Yeah,
death toll on the map. I was like,
yeah,
guys, what are you doing?
it's sensationalism at its best, right? It's inducing anxiety. And so, like, you have to know that. And one of my biggest, when I was doing my webinars on regulation back then, it was like, you don't need to check the news every hour. It's not going to change that much. It's not going to be good for your nervous system. Check in the morning, check in at night, but don't check it 3 hours before you go to bed because it will disrupt your sleep. Yeah. So I think to me, the findings, I think the key thing here, especially for people who voted for Harris, life is filled with disappointments. But we anticipate that those things are going to have a greater impact on us than they really do. And there's some theory around that. We all have a baseline level of happiness. There were studies done with professors like me. I'm lucky I got tenure, but a lot of people don't, and they think, oh my God, I'm going to be in shame, and I'm not going to have a career if I don't get tenure at this university. And what research shows, for the first 30 days, they feel a little depressed, they feel a little down, but they bounce back to their baseline level of happiness. And so it's a good thing for people to know, to support them in not being so devastated by their current emotion, that recognizing that emotion, using, some fancy terms here, is impermanent, is a good thing.
As far as emotions and our politics, it does feel like, for those of us who even remember 2004 or 2000, that, like, as divisive as things felt then, they feel 10 times, 20 times, 50 times more divisive these days. That politics has become personal, has become emotional. I mean, you literally see trend lines of people leaving states and communities because, like, I can't be around people who vote differently from me.
I find that to be the worst thing that anybody could do. That goes back to the non-judgment, listening, and empathy thing as we started.
Yeah.
We've got to figure out how to be in relationship with people who don't agree with us, or we have different values than us. Like, as my father would say, you're pipe dreaming if you think you're going to get everyone to believe the way you believe or think the way you think. That's
Well,
not the goal.
there was like a viral clip from The View, the ABC show, where they're like, at the Thanksgiving table, if they voted for Trump, keep them away from you, disinvite them to Thanksgiving.
I say get curious.
But how do we get there? Like, it feels like societally, it just feels so overwhelming, and it just feels like we're headed in the other direction, where everyone is blocking out the other.
Well, I hope that the work that we do in schools, I was asked this question actually last night from someone around, where do you begin? And I really believe you begin early, because our belief systems get very solidified early on in life. The way we see the world, our worldviews, based on our parenting, based on where we grew up. And the more exposure we get to people who think differently than we are, and the more we have to engage in conversation with them, the better we're going to be as a society.
Important to model curiosity and openness.
100%, right? 100%. Like, it's fantasy land to think that, people who are of a certain religion or a certain, political affiliation or whatever their, values are, like, they're going to just, everyone's going to have the same values across. It's so strange to me that people would think that's even a possibility. And yet, of course, in my work, I meet people from, my program is in every state across the United States. So when I visit people who have different perspectives than I have, I'm not trying to convince them that I'm right. What I'm trying to do is help them see the value of the work that I do for themselves and their children. And so I ask them questions like around emotional intelligence. If they think, oh, this is, you're trying to push your liberal values, for example, onto my child, I said, actually, we're really kind of keeping that separate. I don't talk about my political affiliation or my views ever in my work. What I'm trying to do is help children to have a vocabulary to describe what they're feeling and to have strategies to regulate those feelings. And guess what? I'm not even trying to tell them what strategy to use. I'm trying to help them discover for themselves based on who they are, what's going to work best for them.
Well, yeah. Anecdotally, as we were putting out the survey, they're like, I definitely got it from some people on the right. Like, you're working with Yale University; those are a bunch of liberals over there. I was like, guys, like, we're trying to do a scientific study here, and like the fact that we've gotten to the point where people are unwilling to even take a survey if they have a certain idea about brands associated with it.
I think, yeah, I that is challenging. And, it depends who you talk to, right? If you're, J.D. Vance went to Yale, so did Hillary and Bill Clinton.
Well, and you were talking 2004 election, John Kerry and George Bush both went to Yale.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, it depends on the day whether or not Yale's a good thing or a bad thing.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I think,
DeSantis too, right?
Yes.
There you go.
Yep. So, we admit people of all political affiliations and teach them the same way we teach anybody else. Nobody's getting, pulled aside and like, no, you're going to get your degree in science, through this lens versus that lens. Everybody gets the same education.
Marc, I appreciate you taking time to chat, for working with us on this study, and looking forward to continuing the conversation.
Me too.